All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're taking a deep dive into Genesis 1:27.
We're talking way beyond the surface level here.
Yeah, we're assuming you already know the verse by heart.
You've probably preached on it, taught it, maybe even dreamed about it.
But trust me, there's a whole universe of meaning hidden there, just waiting to be uncovered.
We've been analyzing sermons, seeing how pastors across different denominations are tackling it.
And what we found was seriously impressive. These pastors are going way beyond the usual made in God's image stuff.
They're using Genesis 1:27 as a springboard to talk about marriage, bioethics, even human dignity.
Okay, so spill the beans. What are some of the most unique approaches they're taking?
Well, one thing that really struck me was how several pastors connected Genesis 1:27 to the male-female distinction.
Hold on, isn't that like a super traditional interpretation?
It can be, but they went deeper than that.
Like how?
For example, there's the sermon called God's Redemption, Marriage, Singleness, and Ethical Living.
Okay, what church was that from?
Fresh Streams Church. And they actually linked this male-female distinction to the whole biblical narrative of creation, fall, and redemption.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Back up. How did they make that connection?
They brought in some heavy hitters like N.T. Wright.
Ah, okay, so they're drawing on some serious scholarship here.
Exactly. Wright talks a lot about the importance of embodiment in the Christian faith.
So they're saying that our physical existence as male and female actually points to something deeper.
Yes, something fundamental about our identity and purpose as God's image bearers.
So it's not just a spiritual concept, it's tied into our physical reality.
Right. And get this, they connected this whole idea to the concept of redemption.
So they're taking this one verse and weaving it into the entire story of salvation.
Exactly. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
That's not your typical Sunday school lesson. And you said they tackled some controversial topics too.
Oh yeah, they didn't shy away from anything.
Like what?
Well, this same sermon used the male-female distinction to argue for a traditional view of marriage.
I could see how that could be a bit divisive.
It is, but they backed up their arguments with solid biblical exegesis and theological reasoning.
So they weren't just throwing out opinions, they were really digging into the text.
Exactly. It's a challenging sermon, but it definitely gets you thinking.
Speaking of challenging, there was another sermon, Grounded in Grace, Understanding Marriage and God's Word, that really caught my eye.
Oh yeah, from Oak Community Church, right?
That's the one. They presented marriage as a reflection of the gospel itself.
Whoa, that's a powerful image.
It is. And they use this concept of covenant to connect marriage to God's relationship with humanity.
It's like they're saying that marriage is more than just a legal contract or a social construct.
It's a sacred reflection of God's love and faithfulness.
And what's really cool is how they delved into the historical context of divorce during Jesus' time.
Oh yeah, they even mentioned those different schools of thought, like Shammai and Hillel, right?
They did. It shows that even back then, people were wrestling with these same complex issues.
It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract theological concepts, they have real-life implications.
And sometimes those implications can be pretty controversial even today.
Okay, so let's talk about a sermon that really pushed the envelope, defending human value, the foundation of personhood.
Ah, yes. This one was all about the inherent worth of every human being.
And they tie this back to Genesis 1:27, specifically to the idea of being made in God's image.
Yeah, exactly. The pastor argued that our value comes from being God's creation, not from what we can do or achieve.
That's a powerful message, especially in a culture that often defines worth based on productivity or success.
It is, and they use some really compelling examples to illustrate their point.
Like what?
Well, they talked about Abraham Lincoln and his fight against slavery.
Wow, what a powerful parallel.
It is.
Yeah.
They're basically saying that any attempt to define personhood based on arbitrary criteria is dangerous and ultimately dehumanizing.
And they connected this line of thinking to the pro-life stance.
They did. They argued that if every human being is made in God's image, then every life deserves protection.
That's definitely a thought-provoking approach. It challenges us to re-examine our own beliefs and assumptions about the value of human life.
It does. And it shows how a seemingly simple verse like Genesis 1:27 can have far-reaching implications for how we understand complex ethical issues.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. There's always more to discover.
And speaking of discovery, let's talk about a sermon that brought some joy into the mix. Delight in creation, embracing our divine worth.
Ah, yes. This one was all about basking in the delight God takes in creating each individual.
It wasn't just about being like God in some ways. It was about possessing an intrinsic value because of whose image we bear.
It's a celebration of our unique identity as God's beloved creation, flaws and all.
Exactly. And the pastor shared a really personal anecdote to drive home the point.
Oh, I love a good personal story. What was it about?
Well, they talked about a meditation experience where they felt God's immense joy at the very moment of their conception.
Wow, that's powerful. It's easy to get caught up in the "why am I here?" questions, but to hear that God took pure delight in creating you, that's a whole different level of affirmation.
It is. It reminds us that we're not accidents or cosmic afterthoughts. We're each a masterpiece.
A masterpiece meticulously crafted and deeply loved by our Creator.
Now, that's a message worth shouting from the rooftops.
Speaking of shouting from the rooftops, there was another sermon that caught my ear, Reclaiming Honor, a divine mandate for relationships.
Oh, that one was great. They used a really striking visual analogy, a crumpled $100 bill.
A crumpled $100 bill. Okay, now I'm intrigued.
The point is that no matter how beat up or wrinkled a $100 bill gets, it never loses its value.
So they're saying that no matter what someone has been through, they never lose their inherent worth in God's eyes.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect.
And they connected this to real-world actions, right?
They did. They used the example of Nelson Mandela inviting his former jailer to his presidential inauguration.
Wow, talk about honoring someone who might not seem deserving of honor.
It was a profound example of forgiveness, reconciliation, and recognizing the shared humanity that connects us all.
Because like they're saying that true honor isn't about rewarding good behavior, it's about recognizing the divine spark within every person, no matter their past.
It's about seeing people through God's eyes, not our own limited perspective.
Okay, we've covered some fascinating ground here, from the intricacies of biblical interpretation to the ethical implications of being made in God's image.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
There's so much more to explore. What other gems did these sermons have to offer?
Well, one that stood out to me was reflecting God's character in our lives.
From Light Christian Center, I remember that one. They really focused on the idea that we're called to be like God.
Not just called to be like God, we're designed to reflect his character.
So it's not just about following rules or doing good deeds, it's about embodying the very essence of God.
Exactly. And they used a really creative analogy to explain this. A periodic table of divine elements.
A periodic table. It's a new one. I'm picturing God in a lab coat now.
Well, they presented God's character as this complex but unified whole, made up of elements like love, justice, wisdom, power, and so on.
So instead of focusing on individual actions, this sermon provided a framework for understanding the whole of God's character.
And how it should shape our lives. It's about cultivating those divine qualities in everything we do.
That's a pretty tall order. It's not just about being nice, it's about embodying the very heart of God.
It is a challenge, but it's also incredibly inspiring.
It gives us a roadmap for living a life that truly honors God and reflects his image in a tangible way.
And that's a message that I think we can all get behind.
Absolutely. All right, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on in this part of our deep dive.
But we're just getting started.
Stick around for part 2, where we'll explore even more unique insights and practical applications of Genesis 1:27.
You won't want to miss it. Back again for more Genesis 1:27 goodness.
We've already covered so much ground: human dignity, marriage, even bioethics.
But there's still so much more to uncover.
I know, right? It's amazing how much depth there is to this one verse.
And speaking of depth, one theme that really stood out to me was the idea of community.
Community. How did they tie that back to Genesis 1:27?
Well, one sermon, Embracing Unity, Living an Authentic Christian Community, really nailed it.
Okay, and which church was that from?
Kanawha Valley Church. They made the point that being made in God's image isn't just about individual worth.
It's about our capacity for relationship, right?
Exactly. We're designed for connection, for belonging, for reflecting that unity of the Trinity in our own communities.
So it goes deeper than just, God created us to be social creatures.
It's like our very ability to connect with others is a reflection of God's own relational nature.
That's pretty profound when you think about it.
It is. And this sermon went even further, emphasizing vulnerability and authenticity in those relationships.
So true community means letting our guard down, being our true selves, warts and all.
That's the idea. It's about creating a space where people can be seen, known, and loved without fear of judgment.
That's a powerful message, especially in a culture that's obsessed with perfection and image.
It's a reminder that true belonging comes from being accepted for who we are, not who we pretend to be.
So it's not just about showing up for potlucks and Bible studies.
It's about creating a culture of genuine acceptance and vulnerability within our churches and communities.
And that kind of radical acceptance is a beautiful reflection of God's love for us.
Absolutely. It's about embodying the love and grace of God in how we treat each other.
Okay, so we're talking about building authentic community, but what about actually communicating these ideas?
Good point. Effective communication is key.
Especially when you're dealing with complex theological concepts like these.
And you know what? These sermons did a fantastic job of it.
What were some of their secrets? Spill the tea.
Well, one thing that impressed me was their use of storytelling.
Oh, I love a good story.
Everyone does. And these pastors knew how to use stories to bring Genesis 1:27 to life.
Can you give me an example?
Remember that Reclaiming Honor sermon we talked about earlier? The one with the crumpled $100 bill?
Yeah, that one was good.
Well, they took it a step further by sharing the story of Nelson Mandela inviting his former jailer to his presidential inauguration.
Wow, that's an incredible story.
It really drives home the point about seeing people's inherent worth, even in the face of past wrongs.
It's like actions speak louder than words.
Exactly, and that story just packs such an emotional punch.
And by using a real-world example, something people can connect with, it makes the concept of honor more tangible.
It's not just some abstract idea, it's something we can actually see and feel.
So storytelling helps us to connect with these concepts on a deeper level.
Makes them more memorable and applicable to our own lives.
Like, don't just think about these ideas, feel them.
Exactly. And you know what's even more surprising?
What's that?
Some sermons even used pop culture references.
Pop culture in a sermon on Genesis 1:3-7. Now that's creative.
Right. One sermon, Rooted Identity, talked about how even children's shows are shaping cultural narratives around identity.
Interesting.
They used examples from shows like The Muppet Babies and Paw Patrol.
Okay, that's pretty clever. It's a way to connect with parents and address these contemporary issues in a way that's engaging.
Exactly. It shows that you can find inspiration anywhere, even in unexpected places.
It's about meeting people where they are, speaking their language, and making these ancient truths relevant to their lives.
And you know, speaking of relevance, another thing these sermons did well was tackle tough questions head on.
No sugarcoating, no easy answers.
Nope. They acknowledged the complexities of faith and didn't shy away from controversial topics.
Which is so important, right? People are wrestling with real doubts, real struggles.
If we just offer platitudes or simplistic solutions, we're not doing anyone any favors.
We need to be honest about the challenges of living out our faith in a broken world.
And these pastors weren't afraid to do that.
For example, defending human value really dove into the abortion debate.
They didn't hold back. They made a clear and compassionate case for the sanctity of life from conception.
And while that's a very sensitive and potentially divisive issue,
they presented their viewpoint with a lot of respect and sensitivity.
It's not about forcing people to agree. It's about encouraging thoughtful dialogue.
It's about recognizing that there are no easy answers and inviting people into a deeper conversation.
This is not just about preaching at people, it's about journeying with them through these tough questions.
Exactly. And you know, another powerful element that came up was personal testimony.
Ah, yes. The power of vulnerability.
Several pastors shared their own stories about how Genesis 1:27 had impacted their lives.
It's one thing to hear someone talk about abstract concepts.
It's another thing entirely to hear them share from their own experience.
It makes the message so much more relatable and real.
Like, you're not just getting a lecture, you're getting a glimpse into someone's heart.
And their struggles and triumphs along the way.
Exactly. And one story that really stuck with me was from the Delight in Creation sermon.
What was that one about?
The pastor talked about experiencing God's delight at the moment of their conception.
Wow. That's a very personal and powerful story.
It is. It speaks to the truth that our worth is inherent, not something we have to earn.
We are loved simply because we are.
And I think that's a message that everyone needs to hear.
It's so easy to get caught up in trying to prove our worth.
But this story reminds us that we're already enough in God's eyes.
It's a beautiful reminder of God's unconditional love and acceptance.
And, you know, that kind of vulnerability is what makes these sermons so impactful.
It's what allows people to connect with the message on a deeper level.
It's what makes the message real.
So we've talked about community, storytelling, tough questions, personal testimony.
We're just getting warmed up.
There's even more to explore. Welcome back to the show. We're wrapping up our Genesis 1:27 deep dive.
And we're ending on a high note, talking about the art of communication.
Because what good are amazing insights if you can't get them across?
Preach it. These pastors were masters of communication, especially given the complexity of these topics.
So give us the inside scoop. What made them so effective?
Well, one thing that really stood out was their creative use of analogies and illustration.
Oh, yeah. Analogies can be so powerful.
They really helped to make abstract ideas more concrete and understandable.
Can you give us some examples? I'm always looking for fresh inspiration.
Well, there was this one sermon reflecting God's character in our lives.
Okay, what was the analogy?
They compared God's character to a periodic table.
Whoa, a periodic table. That's pretty out there.
I know, right? But it worked.
How so?
Instead of just listing God's attributes, they presented them as these distinct but interconnected elements, kind of like elements on the periodic table.
Oh, I see. So love, justice, wisdom, all these divine qualities were like elements that combined to create the fullness of God's character.
Exactly. And just like elements on the periodic table can combine to form all sorts of compounds, these divine elements work together to make up the whole of who God is.
That's a really neat way to visualize it.
And it makes it easier to understand how we, as image bearers, are called to reflect those same elements in our own lives.
Not just pick and choose the ones we like, but really embody the complete essence of God.
That's the goal. And they made it so clear and memorable with that analogy.
Analogies are like mental shortcuts. They help us grasp complex ideas more quickly.
Totally. And there were so many other great ones.
Like the Trumpled $100 bill, right? We talked about that earlier.
Yep, that one was a classic.
What were some other ones that stuck out to you?
Well, in Delight in Creation, the pastor talked about seeing God's delight in even the simplest of creatures, like pigeons.
Pigeons. Okay, now I'm really curious.
It might sound odd, but it was a beautiful illustration of how God takes delight in all of creation.
Even the things we might consider ordinary or even annoying.
It's like a reminder to pay attention to the little things, to see the spark of the divine everywhere.
To find the extraordinary in the ordinary.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another key element of communication: vulnerability.
Ah, yes, vulnerability. We touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth emphasizing.
It's so important. These pastors weren't afraid to be real with their congregations.
They shared their own stories, their struggles, their doubts.
It takes a lot of courage to be that open and vulnerable, especially from the pulpit.
It does. But it's also what makes the message so powerful.
It allows people to connect with the message on a deeper level.
Because they see that their pastor isn't some perfect, untouchable being.
They're a human being just like them, who's also on a journey of faith.
And who's been through their own share of ups and downs.
Exactly. And when pastors are willing to share their own stories, it creates space for others to do the same.
It breaks down those walls and fosters genuine connection.
So it's not just about delivering a perfectly polished sermon.
It's about being real, being relatable, being human.
And letting people know that they're not alone in their struggles.
It's a reminder that faith isn't about having all the answers or presenting a perfect facade.
It's about embracing our shared humanity and relying on God's grace in the midst of our imperfections.
And that's a message that I think resonates with everyone.
Deeply. It's
Yeah.
what makes these sermons so impactful.
All right, as we wrap up our deep dive into Genesis 1-7, what key takeaways would you offer our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is to be bold, be creative, and be authentic.
Don't be afraid to push the boundaries, to explore new ideas, to make unexpected connections.
And don't be afraid to be yourself. Let your personality shine through.
Use vivid language, tell captivating stories, and come up with analogies that stick.
And most importantly, be vulnerable.
Share your own journey of faith. Let people see your heart.
Because that's what really connects with people.
It's what makes the message come alive.
So go forth, fellow sermon crafters and Bible explorers.
And may your messages be filled with creativity, wisdom, and the transformative power of God's grace.
Until next time, keep diving deep.